And without further ado, Bob, please introduce yourself and take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's good to be here. My name is Bob Lawson, and I'm with an organization called In the Public Interest. And In the Public Interest is it's a national nonprofit research and policy organization, and we look at public goods and services, and we work with community organizations, unions, et cetera, to talk about the impact of privatization on our society. And that's really what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about how the privatization of our democratic goods, services, and institutions, in my opinion, has put the promise of American democracy at the greatest risk of any time since the 1930s and possibly the Civil War. And I want to be clear when I talk about the American democracy, I'm talking about it as a promise or an aspiration. It's never been a reality. You know, as a country that was founded by stealing the land from the native people, that wealth was developed by enslaved Africans, that when our Constitution was written, that African-American slaves were 3/5 of a human being, so their owners could have more of a vote. Women couldn't vote. We still have plenty of anti-democratic electoral institutions, such as the Electoral College or the US Senate. So what I'm talking about is this aspiration that we've tried to achieve of American democracy. And I would say that the history of this country has been one of a struggle between those who want to make the American promise of democracy a reality and those who want to limit the democracy so that all of the economic and political power can be concentrated in their hands rather than shared by all of us. And I think a premise of having a democracy is this famous quote by Chief Justice Louis Brandeis, that we can have a democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. I think that's a key to the aspiration of American democracy. And you may get a hint of where I'm going by this quote. That I would say that I want to clarify a few things what I'm talking about in democracy before I get into making my argument. That when I'm talking about the promise of democracy, I'm not just talking about the right to vote, although that's pretty important, and it's even more important as days go by. But the promise of democracy has always been that all people are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that all of us have an equal chance to achieve that. And the role of government and our public institutions is to ensure that we all have that equal opportunity. Since all of us have different interests and we have different perspectives, the role of government is to balance those interests and to even them out so that they can fight for the common good and develop laws and institutions and regulations that can expand this access to our public goods. So what do I mean by public goods? You know, things that we can only do together, like cleaning the air or ensuring every person has quality health care, or the things that we all benefit from, regardless of whether we use the specific service or not, like handicap parking places, or air traffic control, or researching the environmental impacts of certain industries, or the things that protect and support us, like safe food, Social Security, Medicare, et cetera, or the things that make us a better, fairer, more compassionate and democratic nation, like wage and hour laws, workplace safety regulations, antitrust regulations, our social safety net. I think all of these are what I refer to as a public good. You know, other examples just really quickly would be our public education, public transit, healthcare, clean water, public infrastructure like roads, water treatment plants, bridges, all these things like green spaces, et cetera. And then a whole larger thing that I think is a public good that allows us all access to the opportunity to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is economic security. And as I said, that government's role is the vehicle for protecting and delivering those goods to everyone. But I would also say, and I think it would be pretty obvious, that government doesn't always do things that are for the public good. So just a couple things. I think of social justice, and I'm making the argument that social justice is a public good and that mass incarceration is not a public good, even though our government does it. freedom from violence, including state violence, is a public good. And the things that keep people out of prison, like good housing, mental health, are important public goods. I would also argue that restricting the health care of women for religious reasons is not a public good, that health is a public good that includes access to affordable health care and all. So for the sake of today's discussion, that I'm going to say that when I'm talking about the promise of American democracy, I'm talking about democratic control and access to public goods in the broadest sense that I'm talking about here. And I would also just reiterate that I think governments are the essential institutions to ensure that these competing interests protect the public good. That's what I say is the American dream, or the promise of American democracy. So why am I arguing or suggesting that it's imperiled today? I'm old enough to know that over the past 50 years or so, we've seen that what I would argue is the high point of American democracy is gradually being demolished over the privatization of our public goods, services, and the erosion of our democratic institutions and turning them over to private interests. Generally, these are for-profit corporations or the very wealthy. And at the same time, that's been driving down the standard of living and the quality of life for the majority of the people. And how do I come to that conclusion? Well, to state something fairly obvious, our country, which is arguably the wealthiest in history, has the highest level of income inequality in our history. For example, the richest 22,000 households now collectively enjoy more income than the poorest 50 million households. Or an example even closer to Chicago is when you look at Milwaukee, the Black median household income is 30% less today than it was in 1979. Our country, which once defined the free flow of information as the lifeblood of our democracy, freedom of press, blah, blah, blah. Today, we rank 45th among the nations when it comes to press freedom. Our country, which we defeated smallpox. In my lifetime, we defeated polio. And we led the world for generations in our medical innovation and discovery. We now have the worst healthcare system for outcomes by any developed country, by any measure in the world today. And our response to the pandemic indicates that. Our public education system, which was developed right after the Civil War, was once the envy of the world, but we now rank 91st in access to basic quality education. And as the land of the free, we lead the world in mass incarceration, with over 2 million incarcerated. The number of prisoners per 100,000 people in the US is 737. Our closest competitor is Russia, and they only have 615. So what I'm saying is that what every other prosperous and successful democracy deems to be like fundamental rights of democracy, like universal health care and access to quality public education or a social safety net, we dismiss as being a weakness or as not deserving or as socialism or something. And as I said, I'm happy there's a couple of people who are close to my age on this meeting, is that I've seen this through the course of my lifetime. I've actually lived through what I think is, excuse me, the greatest expansion of American democracy. And I've witnessed this struggle between those who want to expand democracy and those who want to shrink it. So let me talk just a little bit about my life to highlight this. During the post-World War II period, when I grew up, we saw an expansion of government and public goods and services like Social Security, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Security and Exchange Commission, and other New Deal programs like unemployment insurance, the minimum wage, the National Relations Act, so on. All of these were part of the New Deal program, which was where my parents grew up. And this New Deal consensus was based in large part on the philosophy that articulated by FDR, where he said the true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and interdependence, or what I would call in a much less eloquent way, that we're all in this together view. My parents knew how crucial a government that worked for everyone was key to the good life. They deeply respected the role of government and their responsibility as citizens, and they passed that on to me. And the reason they knew it is because it helped our family get a better life. My dad was a World War II veteran. When he got out of the war, he was able to go to college because of the GI Bill. Because he got that education, he got a job as a public servant with a state that had full benefits. He had Social Security, pension for life. When we moved from the Midwest to California, the interstate highway system was just being developed as an ambitious way to link the country. We were able to buy our house when I was a kid with the FHA loan guaranteed by the federal government. I went to a school, a good public school that had arts, music, sports. We could go on vacations to state parks and national parks that were free at that time, and they were expanding. And while I was in school, the US was developing a space program and sending a man to the moon as part of a national pride and a national project. In school, we spent a lot of time studying civics and learning about our responsibility as citizens. And I grew up in California, and we had, at that time I was growing up, something that was developed that was called the Master Plan of Higher Education, which guaranteed that every single student who graduated from high school in California could go to at least community college for free. They were guaranteed admission to a free community college. If they wanted to, they could go to the Cal State college system, which is now the Cal State University system, at very low cost, or the University of California system. If you graduated from community college, you could guaranteed admission into the Cal State system. And these systems were heavily subsidized by the state so that they were cost very little. Student debt was not an issue. Obviously, some people borrowed money, but at that time, there was no such a thing as a student loan or student debt industry like there is now. And for people that didn't want to go to college, there were good paying jobs because they were mainly union jobs. 30% of the workforce at that time were in unions that had full benefits, economic, not just the pay, but health insurance, pensions. And that's because the rights of workers to organize and bargain collectively was protected by strong government regulations and was accepted as part of our democracy. And I remember in school that when businesses were getting too big and they were talking about having too much power, that they were broken up. Trust busters was a phrase. You don't hear it today, but trust busters was a famous phrase for busting up too much economic power. And I know this will be a surprise to many people, but TV was free because the airwaves belonged to all of us. We didn't have to like our cable provider or our streaming service. When I graduated from high school, the top income tax rate was 91%. Now it's 37%. The corporate tax rate was 50%. And today it's 21% before deductions and incentives. And most big corporations now pay no taxes. All this revenue allowed the government to have these services that were expanding to more and more people and making the American dream more of a reality. And that was because people believed that government had a positive role to play in promoting the common good, and that people had a duty as citizens to support it by paying their taxes, and that those who had the most should pay the most. That was the prevailing view. And just to give you some sense of how different it was then, is that in 1958, 73% of the Americans said they had faith in the federal government. Think about that. In 2019, it was down to 17%. So it was clear that after the New Deal, the World War II, that the American people supported government action, they paid higher taxes, and they ensured that the wealthy and the corporations paid their fair share. They provided quality services. They built an economy based on middle-class jobs, At that time, it had the smallest gap between the rich and the rest of us in history. It didn't close the gap in any way, shape, or form, but it had the smallest. And it certainly wasn't true for everyone. You know, there was the Jim Crow South was still in existence in the agricultural fields, that farm workers didn't enjoy any of this. And there was structural racism built into so many of our best federal programs that African Americans couldn't access them. And people my age who were growing up then, believing in this American dream and in this reality, we looked around and we saw that this whole idea of American democracy was great, and that we're all in this together philosophy was great, but lots of people were being left out. African Americans in the South didn't have the right to vote. Despite Brown versus the Board of Education decision, the 50s schools were still segregated. Rural people in Appalachia were living in deep poverty, and their rivers and environment were polluted by coal mines. Women were still grossly unequal in this society, and LGBTQ rights weren't even on the horizon. So those of us who believed in this began fighting for a more inclusive and democratic society and an expansion of these public goods that we had enjoyed. And we wanted to expand our democratic institutions to make the promise of American democracy more real. We really, or I'll speak for myself, believe that things could only get better. And our movement helped win many of these important victories that expanded rights that people today kind of take for granted. We helped pass the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the War on Poverty, Medicare and Medicaid, the Clean Air Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the Endangered Species Act, a whole bunch of consumer protection laws, the American with Disabilities Act, and we even pushed for funding for the arts through the National Endowment of the Arts. So in my early adulthood, the promise of American democracy was getting closer. The 20th century really had a lot of very progressive successes that are being eroded and taken for granted these days. So for my life, during my life up to the mid 70s or 80s, I saw this government expansion, this expansion of democracy as a reality. And we saw that, you know, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was becoming more of a reality for more people. But since that time, I've watched as things have gone the opposite direction. And it's been actually pretty horrifying. So what happened? Well, I would argue that much of what we see today is the result of an explicit policy choices pushed by conservative pro-business forces that were designed to discredit government and secure the political control over our public goods. They carried out a 50-year strategic attack on democratic government that impacts everything we care about and limits what we can do in the future. This in no way started with the Trump presidency, but it's been decades in the making. It's just been accelerated. You know, one of the, I would say, beginning points of this becoming a reality was this quote I just put up from Milton Friedman. It was a famous New York Times essay in 1970. He was an economist from the University of Chicago, and he argued in no uncertain terms that the only responsibility of business was to make a profit. That Friedman went on to win the Nobel Prize in 1976, and he became unfortunately, one of the most consequential economists and ideologues of the 20th century. And his views are still prominent today, as we see all around us. But in the 70s, he was defining a much different role for business in our society than had been the prevailing view since the New Deal. And, you know, you can see this, I'm not going to read the whole quote, but basically anything that business did good other than getting rich was a socialist view. And so that in order for this to become a reality, though, they had to get government to do something different instead of doing all these regulations. In other words, the government had no right to get in the way of the free market. So they had to develop strategies to make this a reality. And I'm going to say that in order to implement Friedman's strategies, they had 5 basic strategies, although this is not complete. It's not they're kind of arbitrarily defined or whatever. But they had a plan for coordinated corporate action. They had to engage in a war of ideas. They had to capture the institutions of government, and then they had to weaken government from within, and then they had to weaken the opponents in the democratic institutions. So I want to talk a little bit about that. This is this quote I just put up is from Lewis Powell, who was later appointed to the Supreme Court, and he was laying out a strategy of how you can implement Friedman's views, and that corporations by this time were pretty clear that all of these regulations were hurting their bottom line. They had actively opposed the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, et cetera. They wanted market share, revenues, profit. They knew that if they could lower their costs, that they could make more profit. So they opposed regulations that kept people safe and healthy. They wanted to lower taxes so they could have more money. And it would also deprive us of the revenue we needed to implement the programs. And they wanted to get government contracts. So they wanted to advocate for the privatization. So they were very clear on how their interests were different. And they tried to figure out how to do this. So this Lewis Powell memo, which I put a part up here, sort of lays out how they had to organize. And it's been sort of a driving memo. I'm not going to read it, but it talks about, organization, et cetera. I just want to go through the steps of this. So in order to institute this, institute the ideas in this memo, corporations began acting in concert. And they figured out there are basically, 3 ways they needed to do this. They had a meeting in 1974 and 75. It was called the Conference Board. And they came up with and developed these strategies. One is they needed to function as a coordinated group rather than as separate industries, so that they could push together, so that one company's issue became others. And they also didn't want their brands to be associated with like pushing against health and safety regulations and so on. So they wanted to create these groups that they could hide behind. So the Chamber of Commerce, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, or the Small Business Association. These became the vehicles for them to fight against changes in their individual industry. And they realized that they had to invest more in politics and lobbying in order to carry this out. So they started to build infrastructure of think tanks and to engage in what I'm calling the battle of ideas. And once they put all these ideas together, the results was that they started pursuing this overlapping, increasingly aligned and well-resourced efforts to reshape the political and economic landscape. And a key component of that was to change who ran our democratic institutions. So since they were coming up with, the New Deal era with the Great Society era, they knew they had to change the public definition, the war of ideas. That FDR had said that individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and interdependence, that they took the idea of American freedom, and which was rooted in individual choice, but they made corporations individuals. So part of individual freedom was freedom for corporations. And because our movements in the 60s and 70s had to target government as like the enemy of racial justice, or as the perpetrator of the war in Vietnam, there was a lot of anger in the air at the government, that people thought the government was not doing well. So they were able to tap into both this anti-government sentiment that had been created by the progressive movement that was seeking to expand democracy, and tie it to the individual freedom idea. and begin to undermine government. And so they doubled down on these ideas. They were pushing the trickle-down economics, the free market theory, while also saying and pushing in so many ways that government was, the enemy, the negative attitudes. And as I said, they poured millions of dollars into think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, and in Illinois, the Illinois Policy Institute. And they went beyond that. They began funding university chairs and institutes to push these ideas. Just one example, one of the biggest and most well-known right-wing funders are the Koch brothers. The Koch money funds individual courses, professorships, fellowships, and even research and policy programs at universities around the country. They call this investing in the intellectual raw materials of free market advocacy. And right now, there are at least 40 centers at prominent American colleges and universities that are funded directly by the Koch donor network, and they get to control who runs those centers and what the philosophy that are being taught there. So they began through these think tanks and through these universities and through public intellectuals, a drumbeat of these key messages, things that seem like commonplace today. Private companies are more efficient, cheaper, better, faster. The market will determine who gets what. Government wastes taxpayers' hard-earned money. Regulations hurt the economy, kill jobs, take away your freedom. And government serves someone else, not you. It serves the welfare queens, the immigrants. It serves the people in Portland, or the overpaid government workers. So they began pushing this as part of their war on ideas, and those ideas have had a lot of impact. Here we can see, beginning with Barry Goldwater, a government big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take everything away. He didn't win, but they kept this drumbeat going on till Ronald Reagan came along. The 9 most terrifying words in the English language: I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And perhaps I think the most important and telling quote that I have on this particular slide is the one from Lee Atwater. He was both a Reagan advisor, but he was also a major campaign strategist for Republicans for decades. And he understood that running on a platform of give more money and power to the rich was not a winning strategy. So what he had to do was figure out how they could create a new enemy rather than the rich. And so he saw that small government was a code word for no assistance to poor people, particularly poor people of color. He said this on his deathbed. I guess he felt bad for what he'd done. But the racism that has permeated our country has been used by the right to both discredit government and focus people on the wrong enemy. And by the time, Bill Clinton came along, that this whole view of government as being in the way of freedom and progress was common wisdom in both parties. Remember when Clinton said the era of big government is over, and then he demolished the welfare system and unleashed the Securities and Exchange Commission. And to never wants to let a crisis go to waste, as a famous Chicago mayor once said. They've been using this pandemic to push their messages even more. That big government allowed the coronavirus to spiral out of control, or free markets are the best antidote to the coronavirus. So this war of ideas is ongoing. You can look at it every day. I think you'll see it in the campaign ads against the Fair Tax Initiative. But they also understood that just winning the war of ideas was not good enough, that they had to also capture government. And I don't mean just winning elected office, which they certainly were interested in doing and did successfully, but they wanted to control all the levers of government. So I mean like staffing of the important and powerful government institutions with corporate executives and corporate lobbyists. Sort of now we take it for granted that the Secretary Treasurer is going to be someone from the big banks or the hedge funds. And all too often these corporate representatives put the interests of corporations before the interests of the public. And so government then becomes a tool of the corporate right to transfer more wealth to the wealthy and to deregulate, et cetera. They've also been stacking the courts with judges who share their philosophical and political views. They've set up a pipeline called the Federalist Society, which many people have probably heard of. They're beginning in law school, and they, through internships, they move people from internships to jobs, and they funnel them into this pipeline for conservative free market judges to be ready to be appointed to judgeships. And while this strategy has obviously been pursued for decades, it's really come to fruition in the Trump administration. This little graphic is somewhat telling, but just for a few examples, people probably know more of these, but you know, the EPA Secretary, Andrew Wheeler, he's a former coal lobbyist. Since he's been in there, the Trump administration has rolled back over 100 environmental regulations, including abandoning the rule barring coal companies from dumping waste into streams and waterways, so that new coal plants can open up easier, and allowing higher levels of mercury pollution into the air. Or take the Labor Department that's supposed to protect workers. The Labor Secretary, Scalia, famous Supreme Court Justice Anton Scalia's son, who's been a corporate lawyer. Just I think yesterday or the day before, they issued a new proposed ruling that could make millions of janitors, construction workers, rideshare drivers, food delivery drivers, independent contractors rather than employees, so their employers wouldn't have to pay minimum wage, overtime, share the Social Security costs, or contribute to unemployment or workers' compensation, thus increasing income inequality and creating a massive crisis for Social Security in the decades ahead. Or Lord knows we could talk about the post office. Besides the horrible things that he's doing now, he owns companies that is both, one is a competitor to the post office, the other company that he owns is a major contractor with the post office. And he's making the decisions about how the post office should use its resources. Finally, I could go on and on, but the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, is not an educator. She's opposed to public education. Her whole career has been funding right-wing politicians and working to dismantle public education. You can look at what she's done to that mess in Michigan with their public education system. And she's on a roll right now. And with the courts, you know, the most prominent example up until probably this week was Mitch McConnell's denial of the vote for President Obama's choice to fill the vacancy on the Supreme Court. It had never happened before. And the only business really that the US Senate has been able to conduct is appointing federal judges. And if you look at the record, the Trump, McConnell, they've confirmed more judges at a faster rate than any recent administration other than Jimmy Carter's. And the reason they did that in Jimmy Carter's is because the judiciary was greatly expanded then. And if they get to appoint this new Supreme Court justice, which I'm sure they will, this will be the most conservative Supreme Court we've had since the 30s that was trying to dismantle the child labor laws, et cetera. So you kind of get the picture what I'm talking about on the corporate control of government. And once they get control, then they have a plan for what they do when they get into government. They began to weaken government from within through what I would just say 3 strategies: austerity, deregulation, and privatization. And they were pretty clear. One of my favorite right-wing leaders is Grover Norquist, because he's always clear about what he wants to do. You probably know this quote: I don't want to abolish government. I want to reduce it to the size where I can drag it into the bathtub and drown it in the bathtub. Grover Norquist is the head of Americans for Tax Reform, hates government subsidies. Unfortunately, he was one of the very first ones to get a paycheck protection loan from the current government. But we won't go there on that. I want to talk about the things that government is, they're doing inside of government. So the first one I'll talk about is austerity, or starve the beast. It's, that it's a strategy of cutting government funding through massive tax cuts, generally tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations, or they impose spending rules and limits on governments. Like in California, we have Proposition 13 that limits property taxes. We have rules that have any kind of a tax increase takes 2/3 of a vote of the legislature, but a tax cut only takes a majority. Colorado has TABOR, the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, which imposes limits on government spending. And in times of economic downturn, these pro-austerity, whatever you want to call them, conservatives, free market economists, talk about that we don't need more government spending when there's a crisis, making the argument that a government should severely cut its spending as the primary way of dealing with the economic downturn. That's what's going on now. When government spending is needed the most to boost the economy, they argue that spending should be the least. The Trump tax cut is just the latest example of cutting federal funding by cutting taxes for the wealthy. Even in 1979, the tax rate for top taxpayers was still 77%. Today, it's down to 37%. And while as I mentioned, the corporate tax rate today is 21%, most corporations pay much less. And according to the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy in 2018, 60 of America's biggest corporations paid no federal income taxes on $79 billion in US pre-tax income. And instead of paying the $16.4 billion in taxes at the 21% rate, they enjoyed a net corporate tax rebate of $4.3 billion. So rather than paying their fair share, they're dragging government resources to their bottom line. And we've obviously seen the impacts of these policy decisions during this COVID crisis. The health agencies are unable to deal with this crisis. The unemployment insurance system can't handle the influx. Just this week, the governor of California announced that they're not going to take any new unemployment claims for the next 2 weeks, just because the system is so overwhelmed, they have to catch up with where they are. And so this has been a conscious strategy to deprive government of the money to provide the quality of services that they need. And that's why every time you hear a program come up for the social good, you're going to hear the quote unquote deficit hawks. They're called deficit hawks because they allegedly hate deficits, budget deficits, although that's only true when it's about social programs. The deficit hawks were the ones that always vote for tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy, and they never ask where the money's coming from. The federal budget deficit has always gone up by huge amounts when Republicans control the government. It goes Reagan, Bush, Trump, all have made huge increases into the federal deficit. But then they turn around and say, we can't do this program because of the deficit, and they try to cut Social Security and Medicare. So this lack of revenue, it's a long-winded way of saying that it has really real consequences because we can't fund social programs that we took for granted. That's why our public education system is so underfunded. That's why we essentially have no public health system. Environmental cleanup is at nowhere where it needs to be. Our government computer systems are not up to speed. They're not modernized. And the other impact of this is that lacking these resources, that the quality of services goes down. So people get more pissed off at the government, and it reinforces the idea that the government is inefficient and can't do the job, lends weight to the idea that you need to cut taxes and funding to the government. The other strategy that they went with was deregulation. In the 70s, as I mentioned, there was a lot of new regulations that really impacted corporate profits. So they had to figure out how to stop the new regulations and begin to roll them back. This slide, which is really hard to read, is a list of all the regulations that the Trump administration had rolled back up to a couple of weeks ago. There's a citation for it if you really want to look up all of them and be really depressed. But anyway, one way that they really got around this whole push of regulations was they changed the criteria for what it took to make regulations to making it a cost-benefit analysis about economic growth and costs, instead of considering things like health and safety and environmental impacts, et cetera, that you always had to figure in a cost-benefit analysis that made it much harder to introduce regulations and much easier to roll them back. The push for deregulation, started long before Trump. I remember when Jimmy Carter was president, they started deregulating as sort of the new Democrats, but it has proceeded through every administration, but it's been accelerated under Trump, and it continuing with my depressing stories that I'll tell you a couple more of the regulations. In September 2019, they repealed the Clean Water Rule, which had been put in place by the Obama administration to protect the streams, the wetland, and the seasonal bodies of water from chemical and industrial pollutions. So in addition to just allowing this new pollution to clog our waterways, this rollback actually threatens the safety of the drinking water of 117 million Americans and 60% of our nation's fresh water. Obviously, this regulation was rolled back because deep-pocketed developers, the fossil fuel industry, and mining companies were aggressively pushing for it. At the very same month they did that, the US Labor Department overturned an existing overtime pay rule, taking overtime pay away from 8 million workers. Unsurprisingly, the retail and restaurant industry were behind this push to deregulate so they wouldn't have to pay overtime. This deregulatory push of agencies and the courts, it's allowed, massive corporate monopolies to grow, like air travel, oil and gas, et cetera. And most of these regulatory changes are not apparent to most people, which makes them particularly dangerous. Writer Kurt Anderson recently put it, quote, "Countless nuts and bolts changes so dweeby and tedious and so often bipartisan that they appeared inconsequential were uncontroversial." And he went on to describe the process as, quote, and I'm quoting him here, "screwing by inaction," end quote. And over time, these rule changes have really turned our lives upside down in ways that most of us don't even notice on a day-to-day basis. And this push for deregulation is being accelerated. The third way that they are undermining government from within is privatization. Privatization occurs under a lot of different names: outsourcing, contracting out, public-private partnerships. But ultimately what it means is removing public goods, services, assets from our public democratic control and putting it under the private control of a corporation. The specifics vary all over the place, but what makes a difference is who is controlling these assets and who is controlling those institutions. Really, who gets to decide what to do with our public goods? Just some quick examples. I'm sure you all know plenty more of privatization. There's the privatization of services, which is like social services, road maintenance. The school system outsources its food services or its custodial care. Our operations of jails and prisons have been outsourced. The outsource of public infrastructure would be like public-private partnerships. Many of the toll roads are actually, the profits go to for-profit corporations, or leasing a drinking water to a private corporation. And another way of privatization that isn't often talked about, but people should be more aware of, is through creating parallel systems that are completely separate but provide the same services. The biggest example of that, we don't have time to go into the details of it here, is the whole charter school system, where they've created a whole new system of that public funds are going to fund a second school system, dragging huge numbers of resources away from our public schools and putting the control of those resources in private hands. And like many of the things that they knew that there was a good demand for public services, for government services. So you couldn't say, no, I'm going to take your services away from you. You know, they had to figure out a way to take these services away, but not act like it. So this guy, Stuart Butler at the Heritage Foundation, came up with this ingenious idea, put this long quote up here, but essentially to highlight it, the conditions must be created in which the demand for government spending can be diverted into the private sector. Changing the political dynamics of government spending in this way is the secret of privatization. In other words, that you would pretend that you were providing government services, but you were giving the money over to the private sector that would then control those resources. So instead of government spending on public goods, that money could be diverted to the private sector. And I would say, are they that cynical? Yes, they're that cynical. Why am I going backwards? So what's wrong with privatization? Really quickly, as I mentioned, you lose democratic control, that the decisions are made for private benefit, not by public servants who are accountable. Many of the contracts actually contain clauses that explicit limit the policymaking and planning ability. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Almost none of them have the cost savings. Why don't they have the cost savings? Because they're about making a profit. So the only way you can make a profit is to take money off the top, and that's to promise a lot and not deliver. Most of the contracts have built-in clauses for cost overruns and change orders, which drive up the cost from the initial cost. And additionally, in some contracts, residents have to absorb the higher cost of the privatized services. If you parked at a parking meter in Chicago this morning, you understand what I'm talking about. The other thing that happens with privatization is a reduced service quality. That again, if their main concern is about making a profit, they use cheaper goods, they pay employees less, they use cheaper materials, or they cut back on the services that they provide. And when they do this, that they don't get blamed, government gets blamed for the bad service quality. Another problem with privatization is the loss of middle-class jobs. That private companies, you know, they often change their jobs from, you know, unionized public sector jobs that provide healthcare, retirement benefits, and they change them over to low-wage, non-union jobs with no benefits. This has a particularly dramatic impact on African Americans, because African Americans, 1 in 5 African Americans are employed in the public sector. And the median wages earned by African American employees are significantly higher in the public sector than in other industries. So when these jobs are privatized, more often the impact is on the African American community, and the contracting out has had drastic impact on the median income of African Americans. This is not often understood as one of the problems with privatization. The last problem that I'll talk about is the loss of accountability. You just don't have information. And many of these services are not even subject to the open records laws. So the key information can't even be retained by the public. So basically what it's doing is privatizing, the public assets and turning them over to private industry. So really quick, some examples are the Chicago parking meters, which you probably know. It was a 75-year deal that Morgan Stanley and its consortium, the city has to, anytime they limit access to the parking meters, they have to pay the company money for that limitation, which means when they close roads for community parades or street fairs, they also can't make improvements on many streets without paying the companies. So adding bicycle lanes or expanding sidewalks costs the city more because they have to pay the consortium more. And since it's a 75-year contract, as technology changes, it limits the city's ability to do that without paying the companies even more money. And as you know, that the rates have gone up dramatically to the public for parking meters. And according to the Inspector General for the city of Chicago, that Chicago taxpayers have missed out on almost $1 billion in revenue over those 75 years because of this privatization of these public assets. A second example, really quick, is Iowa. Iowa transitioned its Medicaid program to a private insurance consortium. In Iowa, 25% of the population relies on Medicaids. What's happened since this was turned over, despite the promises of huge cost savings, is that the Medicaid system has basically gone to hell, that the higher administrative costs and the built-in profits are leading to huge cutbacks and denial of services for poor people that need health care. In 2017, the Iowa's Managed Care Ombudsman, however you pronounce that, said there was this huge influx of complaints about denial of services. There's huge problems. I mean, just one egregious example is that an insurer was able to cut the in-home care by 71% for a quadriplegic patient. Think about that. And that was part of the good Medicaid program. In any case, they just got a new public health director in Iowa. Maybe some of this will change, I don't know. The last area I want to talk about is one that people probably don't know too much about. That's the privatization of prisons and immigrant detention centers. That in 2013, my organization actually analyzed a sample of the state level private prison contracts. And they found that over 2/3 of these contracts contained bed guarantees. What this means is that the government by contract has to keep a certain percentage of the beds filled. Typically that was around 80 to 95%, but we even saw contracts where the government was compelled to keep 99% of the beds in private prisons filled, or else they had to pay for empty beds. It ensures that there's no risk at all to the company, and it also puts pressure on the government to keep people in prison beds. Despite how disgusting it is, I would say, to make a profit off of human suffering, these types of contracts actually are an impediment to prison reform, to figuring out more humane ways of dealing with crime. Because the government has to pay for these beds whether or not they're needed. So I would say ultimately that privatization is a quadruple win for the right. They have a smaller government, but not less expensive government. There's weaker public employee unions. There are more government contracts for corporations, and there's no messy democratic control or decision making. So the last part of the strategy, really quickly, is that even though they had all these 4 strategies to help maintain their control of the institutions of government and our democratic goods, is that they knew that they had to weaken the people who were going to fight them on it. That in a strong democracy, their policies really can't prevail because they're not popular. that the fifth component of their strategy has really been to go after and weaken those, I would say the core pillars of progressive power that support public institutions and services. Like unions that like voter registration groups, like the trial lawyers who advocate for consumers and lobby for consumer protection, like federally funded nonprofits like Planned Parenthood. So besides enacting, regulations to weaken these groups, they go after their funding to undermine the ability of these groups to function. That's why the attack on Planned Parenthood has been so outrageous and ongoing at every level. And that's why they're constantly imposing new rules and attacking labor unions. The Supreme Court ruling of Janus, the right to work laws, there's new reporting laws for unions. The amount of reporting that unions have to do compared to corporations is incredible. The National Labor Relations Board is going back and changing over 50 years of precedent in terms of weakening unions' rules. So that's why union membership has dropped from over 30% in the 50s to only about 10% today, even though unions now have a 64% approval rating and more than half of the workers say they would join a union if they could. But not only have they weakened their opponents, they've also used their control of government to change the rules. Like by changing and controlling the courts, they enacted the Citizens United decision that made money equal to speech. They gutted the Voting Rights Act that is allowing states to impose these new restrictions. They've used, obviously, gerrymandered redistricting to make sure that even though the majority of the people of the state of Wisconsin vote for Democratic representatives, that the majority of the legislature is Republican because of the gerrymandering. They're using the census, they're using the post office. And that's, again, I like Grover Norquist because he's right out there about what their intent is to do on all this. We're going to crush labor as a political entity, and we're ultimately going to break the unions. And they don't mean that just about unions. That's quite clear. So what does it mean for us? As I said, there's less money for public services. So fewer people receive the services and support for government declines. That we now are in a situation where there really isn't enough money to fund adequate public housing or public education or public health. And if you look at any reports on the quality of our infrastructure, our bridges, our waterways, our water, they're a mess. There's a wider gap between the rich and the rest of us than we've seen in 100 years. And as this wealth has been concentrated, as Justice Brandeis says, the balance of power shifts. For example, the Rand Corporation just said if US workers today were earning the same share of income as in 1975, they'd be making $1,400 more a month. That's $17,000 more a year. Think about it, if you were making $17,000 more a year, what your life would be like as compared to what it is now. And keep in mind that this big disparity of wealth wasn't always the case. That, in the 30 years between 1947 and 1974, the real income grew close to the same rate as the per capita. So the distance between the poorest, the middle class, and the wealthiest did not increase at all during those 30 years. And that's when we had the biggest middle class. That's when there was the least disparity between racial groups on income. This was the era in which we had the world's best, and most prosperous middle class. But that's changed. And in order to do that, we can see that there's been increased racism and demonizers of government services because they have to channel this anger about people's lives being, demolished against someone else. So rather than against the rich, it's against them. It's against Black people. It's against welfare queens. It's against immigrants. It's against Antifa. So what they've done really is they've changed the prevailing philosophy, at least in mainstream opinion, from the we're all in this together to their you're on your own. And this has real consequences. And I'm not going to belabor this point too much since I've been belaboring it, but just look at public health since we're in the pandemic. Just since 2010, public health systems at the state level have dropped by 16%, at the local level by 18. 38,000 state and local public health jobs have gone since 2008. More than 3/4 of the population live in a state that spends less than $100 a year per person. The National Institute for Health spending on contracting employees has went from 1 million to 95 million. Think about the institutional knowledge that's lost there and the ability to perform public health services. And keep in mind that state governments right now are facing a $555 billion shortfall over the next 3 years that Congress isn't doing anything about. Imagine how drastic these cuts are going to be in 3 years if that holds up. So where does that put us? This is just a quick comparing us to the rest of the world. This is a social progress index, and it sort of shows us where we sit in the world. And it lists, some of the, whatever. These are indicators of quality of life, and you can see quality of public education, we're 91st in the world. Discrimination and violence against minorities, we're 100th. Freedom of expression, 36th. You name it, that the United States is not the leader in the world in any of these. And you can quibble about whether these are the right way to measure these indexes, but it's all relative. And I just saw yesterday actually a UNICEF report looking at the well-being outcomes of children, like the mental health, physical health, academic and social skills in the world's richest country. The US ranks 36 in the world there. So however you look at it, our democracy and our access to a good life has been going backwards. And that's the reality. But what's really amazing is I just saw a new national poll from the Carr Center that says the overwhelming majority of the Americans actually, of all political persuasions, believe in expanded rights for all citizens. For example, over 90% of the Americans believe that these are essential rights to being an American today: clean water and air, quality education, protection of personal data, affordable health care, a job, voting, racial equality. And 87% believe the government has a responsibility to protect these rights. So that is what the prevailing view of the overwhelming majority is. But our reality is so different. How did we get there? Well, just quickly, so we can get into a discussion of this, is that a study a few years ago by Northwestern professor Benjamin Page and Princeton professor Martin Gillens looked at the impact of this 50-year campaign of consolidating power and decision-making. They compared the opinions of average Americans to those of the economic elites and the business-oriented interest groups. And they concluded on this study, quote, "The preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. Lawmakers and other officials listen to the demands of big business." And this study was done even before Citizens United opened the floodgates. By the way, there's a great book on this by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson called Winner Take All Politics. So basically, the strategy that Powell outlined to implement Friedman's vision has been successful. And that until yesterday afternoon, I wasn't even going to talk about what the impact of what's going on right now in our electoral process, but I have to mention it really briefly because I think it's a culmination of this current attack on our voting rights and the undermining of the social postal services. But the part of this strategy over decades has been to limit the right of people to vote. In 1980, Paul Weyrich, some older people remember him. He's a leader of the right-wing movement. He co-founded the Heritage Foundation, the Moral Majority American Legislative Exchange Council. He said, I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down. Now, they had to keep that sentiment under wraps as part of their strategy, but now we have a president of the United States and his right-wing echo chamber outlining this as a public policy for the United States. So that's why I believe that the promise of an American democracy is really at the greatest risk of any time since the 30s and maybe even the Civil War. And really, to sum it up, I was trying to figure out how to do this in a really clever way, and I actually couldn't, but I did. I came across this quote, and it was about the discussion was about how to regulate hate speech on the internet. And this professor, who I don't know anything about, she says, the real question is not whether Zuck is doing what I like or not. The real question is why he's getting to decide. In the ideal world, we have these faceless, nameless experts who tell us this is what you have to do. And I think really that's the question that we're faced with. Who is going to control all of these public decisions, all of our public goods and services, and all of our democracy? Because I think if we're not able to gain control back over these public goods and over our democratic institutions, the promise of America is just history. So with that optimistic view, I'll leave it to you guys to decide. I mean, I think if this is true, what are we going to do about it? If this is not true, convince me otherwise. So that's really what I have to say.
Thank you, Bob. This is fantastic. So we're going to open it up for discussion now. If people want to use the raised hand feature, I think that's going to be the easiest way to start to field some questions. And comments, for that matter.
I know I like to be an optimist, so.
And if you can't find the raised hand feature, go ahead and feel free to type into chat or unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask if that's also easier.
I have a question. I've studied Milton Friedman. I listened to a lot of his lectures and I've read a lot of the things that he's written. I also, I follow the Chicago School of Economics a lot. And it's a new thing for me because I used to be pretty socialist myself. And then I went to Lithuania to visit where my family came from, where my grandparents were actually forced to leave because of the Soviets taking over where they were living. So after that, I started kind of doing a lot more research so that I could be a little bit more well-spoken when I argued against socialist policies and what my own economic opinions were. And I recently had an argument with my fiance, of all people, who also was saying things like, well, most of the economic policies of the conservative economists are in place they don't care about the welfare of human beings, because there is this idea of limiting welfare. And then, of course, the direct idea of when someone says, no, I don't want to give out too much welfare, it immediately conjures ideas that this is unkind. This is something that you do because, as you suggested, it might be a racist policy, or it might be just in general not for the people. And my retort to that was that when you don't offer that much welfare and you give people, instead of just giving a handout to people, you give better means of attaining certain economic goals and attaining certain things, then that person in the long run is going to be a lot better off. And like one thing that I actually agree with is offering maybe 2 years of free college at the community college level or at the public college level. But I also think that there needs to be, I'm a free marketer, I think that there needs to be some competition within that specific market. Because if you look at our public school systems, they're a bummer, right? Our public school system, in particular in the city, is trash. But people come from all over the world to study in the United States, and we have to pay for school. And that to me says something about what that system in itself has done. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't agree with the idea that denying welfare is implicitly bad. I feel that denying welfare can often be seen as sort of a tough love scenario or a kindness in the idea that you're, instead of just telling somebody how to do something, we're all educators here, you're giving people the tools to teach themselves how to do something. And there's many ways to do that, I guess, by providing jobs, by providing different modes of learning, such as library systems, which actually library systems came about as a response to the rise in capitalism. So I just was wondering what you might have to say about that.
Well, I would have a lot to say about it. One is you should visit Chile and find out how your friend, the Friedmans, did there with their country. But just in terms of the things that you're saying, that it is, the idea of giving people the tools to advance in life is, a good thing. But what's happened and what continues to happen is that those tools aren't given. There's a rhetoric of there's the tools, but they aren't given. So just even to take your example, that if you take the poorest people who are living in the city of Chicago that you say are going to the crummy schools, those schools have been purposely defunded over the years by wealthy not paying their taxes. There's nothing inherent in the fact that public schools can't do a good job. You ask anyone who's in education, all of the vehicles are available for public schools, that none of the charter schools in those areas, except the ones that cherry pick who the students are, do any better of job in terms of the measurements we use. But so you start off not giving people the tools, but then you say you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but they don't have the same bootstraps. So the question that I think a society has to balance is who's making that decision about who has adequate tools or not. Is it going to be, let's say Rahm Emanuel's friend Ken Griffin that gets to decide where public education dollars go in Illinois, or does Ken Griffin have to pay his fair share of taxes so our democratically elected people can decide how to allocate those? I think that's part of the, that's part of the thing, because I think what you're saying, it has a lot of merit, which is good about this argument. But if you're studying Milton Friedman, that he would argue that there's no reason at all for corporations to pay any more taxes than they have to, and it's every bit in their interest to drive down the corporate tax rate as much as they possibly can. There's no incentive for them to pay taxes, yet we cannot give people the tools that they need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps unless there's public funding. So it's a contradictory position. And I was kind of being a wise ass about go to Chile, but the Chicago school had a wonderful opportunity to demonstrate how they could really improve society. And they totally destroyed Chile when they went in with the dictator that was put in by the US. We should let other people speak, because it's clear we have a philosophical disagreement on this. But I think that if if we look at the realities, which is why I tried to point to realities rather than just philosophy, that you can get at some of the differences and the contradictions here.
Carol, oh, go ahead, Christine.
No, I was just going to point out Carol's question.
Yeah, Carol left a note in the chat. So other than voting, what do we do about this?
Is this to me?
Yes.
I throw it back on you, but I think that, one of the, the only, I think one of the only things that we have is our voices and our organization. That, that as I alluded to, that one of the reasons why the Civil Rights Act passed, the Voting Rights Act, a lot of the, the environmental laws passed was because people organized themselves in strong ways, made public issues out of it, and started working all the means of power they could. So I think building real organization that is going to vie for political power in the areas that we have, there's more and more limited ways of even vying for political power now, but I think we should take advantage of those. I mean, in Chicago, honestly, I'll say that if you look at like some of the stuff, I would say that the United Working Families Party is trying to do, and some of the other progressive organizations, they're trying to push a much more expansive agenda, and both to use electoral politics, which is a voting piece of it, but community action and public education. But I think part of it is also being a loud voice to expose what's going on, because so much of this goes on behind the scenes. People don't notice what government is doing on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of us, myself included, I'd say, oh, the damn government did that, rather than seeing government as a neutral, as a vehicle that can be used if it's democratically controlled to expand things. Because the solution to every one of our problems, whatever it is wealth inequality. You can't deal with wealth inequality unless you equalize the tax rate. You can't deal with wealth inequality unless you're able to break up the monopolies, because they limit competition. That if you want to eliminate racism, even though the government perpetrates, systemic racism, the only vehicle for eliminating racism is going to be through the government, and so we have to take advantage of those openings and build organizations that can do that. That's what I would argue, other than voting. And I actually think that just voting and getting in these fights around elections are some of the most ineffective times to do it, because people are already polarized. I think you build the issue just as, I would take, Lewis Powell's memo and give it to us and say, we should do the same thing. We just don't have all the money in the world to implement it, but we need to think multi-year and begin building and educating, and also be open to new ideas and figuring out how we can operate in new ways. But we should be clear that the other side has a strategy. When they take government, they have people already groomed to jump in and do what they need to do. We don't have any of that on the more progressive Democratic side. But I would like you guys to talk about that a little bit too, because if I could figure this out, I would write the memo and that would be my talk.
I just want to, could I say something now? I obviously agree about building organizations and organizing and building institutions. I think another piece of that is to understand that what Bob was describing was, how sort of the elites of the, of the corporations and stuff put together this plan. The other piece of that was going on that you could see during the 70s, and I saw it in work around choice and education, was getting people on school boards of really, it isn't just voting, passively voting, it's also, the building of those organizations and getting people into office and having a whole new way of a relationship between the people who get elected and their constituency. And that's a slow process. I mean, that's what's so wonderful about what's happening in Chicago in terms of some of the aldermen who've recently been elected. But I think that that's a long strategic process. And we really have, they've been stocking the pond for a long, long time. And they've thought of this, you know, they lost during the Depression and they started building, you know, I mean, if you even look at the family history of the Kochs, I mean, they started building this for a long time, and we just really have to. And so like a lot of people, you know, when thinking about your futures and what you're going to do is to go into public service, to you know, and to run for office or be involved in your community, because being a citizen, voting is the first thing, but it's I mean, it's an important piece, you know, but it's also that you have to be active and proactive. You just can't sit back and we can't afford to sit back into our private lives or our professional lives. That's my rant.
Bob, there's a question in the chat about any recommendations for other similarly accessible resources, books, articles, etc., for further reading and self-education on the topic.
One is you could go to our website. We have a lot of reports and stories and stuff like that. That's I can put that in the chat. It was at the beginning, but also I would say that there was a book. God, I can't remember the name of it now. Michael, whatever his name is, he's the Berkeley author. It's the fifth question. Someone here knows that. But anyway, the Pearson, the Paul Pearson book that I mentioned, and Edward Sands. Anything by Edward Sands is really good. And I'm trying to think of, you know, there's Rick Perlstein stuff, which I've never read, but he's a Chicago author that's written a history of the right wing. So that's sort of on the assault. I would say those are good. What I'll do, maybe I can think about this a little bit more and come up with a more list and send it to Teresa afterwards, and you could put it with the thing.
I want to say
I'm happy to
Nancy
do that.
McLean is also someone who who wrote a book about the right wing and their strategies.
Yes, Nancy McLean's book is great.
Any other questions or comments?
Sorry, I had a quick question. In the beginning of the, or near the beginning or middle of the presentation, you said something about unions, like union breaking, union busting procedures. A while back, I had seen some Target and Amazon employees sharing a video of what they were shown during their employee orientation, like this whole video dedicated to union words or recognizing union target words so that they could report them to their supervisors or to whoever was above them so that they could get them fired. In the beginning of the video, they said something about we're not really neutral towards unions. Or they said that we are neutral towards unions, but we don't want to antagonize anybody about that. And so due to COVID, I've already seen, like, even when I order anything off of Amazon now, it gets here with the same speed. There's no difference in how their systems are run or how anything else is done. So I wanted to ask you, how is it, or maybe you've already answered this, how is it possible that the biggest company in the world, now one of the biggest companies in the world, is capable of not only continuing to deliver services at the same rate, maybe now even faster than before, in the middle of a pandemic without any press or any kind of government interference of any kind? I realize they don't pay any like federal tax where they don't have to anyway, but how is it possible that they're not they're not even flinching at this death rate, this virus or anything like that, and still being able to do the work that they can?
I think that's the symptom. I mean, I think that really is the issue, that large corporate, I mean, honestly, right now, is that for any private sector employer that wants to avoid a union, they can. You know, that there's almost no way that private sector employees can form a union. That the biggest penalty, if you fire someone illegally for trying to form a union, that the biggest penalty they get is that maybe after 2 or 3 years of hearings, they have to reinstate that person into the job. And if the person got another job in between, they subtract the pay that that person got the job in between from the back wages that they would get. So you go back to work. So it's almost impossible to form a union. But the problem is that many corporations, Amazon is a key example, that they are totally void of government control, that they claim that their employees are not employees, that they're independent contractors, that they they put monitoring devices on individual employees so they move fast enough, and they just have rapid turnover, but there's no regulations. The health and safety, the OSHA has been gutted. So I think that what you're outlining is it's not one thing that can be done. It's a systemic problem, and it hits at it, because Amazon not only does that, but they control the cloud. I mean, it's amazing the amount of monopoly power that a very few white guys have in this society right now over every aspect of our life. So I don't have a simple solution. I wish I did.
But could I say something again? I just want to say that, you know, what you said earlier, I mean, it's an important reason why that there has to be that the power and regulation of the federal government has to be supportive of unions. That isn't just an esoteric kind of thing. That there has to be the weight of society to create a situation in which you would have unionization. And, you know, we never had that perfectly, but we had it before. And even during the Depression, you know, it was very important that they got Roosevelt to basically promote the idea that it was okay to join unions. And that's when in the process of things and union organizing, along with all the organizing on the ground, got started. You know, I mean, that kind of public political support to the general public is just really, really important.
No democratic and social change has really happened in this country without major mass movements and disruption of the system.
Right.
And that's the only way that it's going to happen now. It has to be massive. It doesn't have to necessarily be violent, but it has to be massive, and it has to make the people with the power so uncomfortable that they're willing to make concessions and create institutional changes for more democracy.
And on that note, I thank you very much, Bob. This was very interesting, and thank you for tuning in from California.